Georgian Bay Forever grew out of the GBA in 1995. Georgian Bay Forever is a registered Canadian charity with supporters throughout the region, including concerned cottagers and residents, businesses, and foundations. Their mission is to preserve, protect, and enhance the aquatic ecosystems of Georgian Bay. Our next presenter is Mr. David Sweetnam. He is the Executive Director and Georgian Baykeeper of Georgian Bay Forever.
What I wanted to do today is give you a little bit of a reason why it's important to protect these wetlands that we're talking about. We've got a lot of great information now from the other folks, the other speakers, and in our kind of pre-meeting, we didn't want to step on each other, so we kind of parsed things out. But why are we, protecting these wetlands? We know about wetland functions and wetlands ecosystems, but we actually undertook a project with NASA that we just have finished, just in April, looking at what's happening to wetlands and potentially in the future with the impacts of climate change, what's going to happen to our wetlands. So I wanted to talk to you about that a little bit. We worked with 3 partners. The Great Lakes St. Lawrence River Cities Initiative was a partner on this project, the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, Georgian Bay Forever, and then NASA, not NASA, NASA, right? The real space people. Great Lakes wetlands are not, a huge part of the land cover. Lake Michigan Huron, the middle lake there, is about 117,000 square kilometers of water surface area. And if you look at that, about 10% of it is actually wetlands covered there. So it's important that we protect these areas. And the coastal wetlands are really what Georgian Bay Forever has worked on and is working on and was the focus of this project with NASA. Community concerns, we've heard them expressed around declining water levels, and a lot of work that Georgian Bay Forever has done over the last 20 years has been focusing on the impacts of water levels, on water quality, what's happening with water levels, what's now happening over the last 15, 16 years with climate change impacts in the Great Lakes and how that's affecting evaporative losses and impacting both water quality in our coastal embayments as well as the water levels themselves. So there's a lot of impact at the ecological end of the scale. We did an economic impact assessment to look at what that impact of future expected climate change impacts would be on declining water levels. I figured out it's about an almost $19 billion impact if we don't do something to protect our ecosystems, our coastal ecosystems, because that will impact the economy. And until you start talking to government about the economic impacts of these things, it's hard to get a government official really that fired up politically about protecting a fish. But talk about protecting a job, and it's a whole different kind of discussion. But there are significant impacts on the ecosystems, biological diversity, and our systems, as well as for the municipalities that depend on tourism, cottage income, seasonal income, fishing. There's a lot of money at stake in these various industries. So about an $18.82 billion impact over the next 35 years. That study was done as an academic study and peer-reviewed by academics and kind of came out of the University of Toronto. So the link between the terrestrial and the aquatic ecosystems is our wetlands. Right? And they're kind of this interface, filtering water and providing a whole bunch of functions for us too that we benefit from that we therefore don't have to pay for. If the water is really dirty to begin your refinement process when you're doing a water treatment plant, costs a lot more money than if the water is pristine like it is up in Georgian Bay. You can pull it out and basically do the minimal amount of treatment and have perfectly good drinking water. The wetlands worldwide estimate at a 90% reduction in wetlands. And the ecological and economic benefits kind of go along the lines, as I just mentioned, of filtration and groundwater recharge to this whole idea of biological diversity and the measures that gives us and the linkages that actually really do exist between the economy and ecosystems. Healthy economy, healthy ecosystems. We know that in the past, a lot of the economic factors outweighed the ecological. And what are we paying for now? The Great Lakes Restoration Initiative in the US they keep trying to whittle it down, but $300 million a year to clean up stuff that was done back at the turn of the century. You know? So it's really not free. You're going to pay for it now or later. And we certainly see that on the Phragmites side too. And then the impacts on tourism, ecotourism. The water levels have fluctuated, we know that. This is just a chart over the last 15 years of the study period that we looked at with NASA. But water levels do go up, they do go down, but the general overall trend is what we have to talk about. You know, you can look at the window and the weather changes in an hour, right? Even the water level technically can change in a couple hours if the wind sets up from one direction. But when we look at climate, we have to look at 30 or 40-year periods where we average and take a look at these things over time. And while I still do run into people that are climate change denial people, and I enjoy those conversations very much, I think the predominating wisdom these days is that we can prove these things now. They're not really, even though they're theories, because that's what scientists call them, they're not theoretical. They're actually happening. These are just theories for how the drivers work. And we know the last 2 years that the water levels have rebounded a bit and come up. Last year in particular, we were still rising in Lake Michigan Huron into November. The main part of the reason for that was because the gates were wide open at Lake Superior and water was being flushed out of Lake Superior into Michigan Huron. It wasn't that it was so much wetter in the fall, it was just that there was a lot of water being rebalanced around the system. The NASA study area basically took a swath around the coastline of Georgian Bay. And what we were trying to figure out is what happens to wetlands as water levels go up and down. A lot of people have talked about the fact that all of our wetlands are drying up. And we thought, well, we also know there are places that there's a lot more wetland today than there was when water levels were high. But nobody really had a clue as to what that number was. So we wanted to find out what kind of land classification we could apply here, what the extent of the wetlands were, and then get a time series of how that might be changing, and come up with algorithms to do this all remotely from space, and to do it with kind of software, computer systems, because it's extremely expensive. And Jen has been driving around as part of the initiative to go and survey all of these coastal wetlands, but it's a very expensive, labor-intensive, time-consuming type of project to physically put people on the ground in all of these places. Now, so what you see up here is in July of 1987, we basically were at a high water type of level. That was almost the extreme record. The extreme was in 86. And in June of 2013, that was just as water levels were starting to rebound from the extreme low. So we took satellite imagery that was available to us from those two time periods. We were using the actual water of Lake Huron, Lake Michigan Huron and Georgian Bay, as that water level. So we could see where the coastline was in 1987 at that high point, and we could see where it was in June of 2013. Okay, so we could see those points. And we identified on a really cool, complex, and actually it was also the same technology we built into the tricorder that was mentioned earlier, a net differential vegetated index type thing, where you use different wavelengths of light that are absorbed or reflected by chlorophyll, for example, in a plant leaf. And by knowing what those various ratios are, you can actually start to determine what kinds of plants you're looking at, or what type of vegetation you're looking at. And we were able to construct a map of the wetland coverage. And these are little pixels that are actually about 30 meters by 30 meters in size. But it was well under what the provincial database, the Solris database, had available to it. So quite high density in this imagery. We got rid of anything that wasn't a wetland, so just to leave the wetland space there. And then we did a really cool kind of mapping technique to show where we were losing wetlands, which is red, and where we had gained wetlands in that time period. And one of the most interesting things that you see here is the spatial change. The northern part of Georgian Bay, as water levels dropped, actually created more wetlands. About 7% increase in the northern parts. And in the southern part, we actually had about a 10% decrease in the wetlands that were there. Now this can inform decision making when we actually start to look at where our resilience investments are going to be made as far as climate change impacts. This is the word we're looking at scientifically now and at the government. is how do we look for resilience in the ecosystem and where do we make those investments? But it also points out that protecting southern Georgian Bay wetlands is extremely important too, because we are going to have fewer of those. And that's where the fish are, using for nursery habitat. That's where all of the wildlife and species at risk, lots of them are concentrated in those portions where we're going to have fewer wetlands. So it's very, very critical for us to actually be doing this work. So it's not just our own lack of access to the water, it's our ecosystem needs our help right now. And these things are changing and coming in. So overall, a 3.8% net loss in wetlands from the high water point to the low water point that we saw over that time. And we know we spent a lot of the last 17 years, not the last two, but the 15 years before that, at that low water extreme, right? And that's why people in the southern parts, which were a little more populated, just saw a lot of wetlands disappearing. 10% of their wetlands were gone, and habitat was changing, and it was turning from a coastal marsh into a meadow. Trees, little shrubs were growing in those places, right? And everybody, I think, in the GBA certainly has seen those pictures over the years that we've talked about. So it's really an important finding, we think, that now we can kind of put into this mix too.